Hi everyone, we're here with Sam Cho, who is running for the Port of Seattle, position 2. Would you like to go ahead with the 2-minute introduction?
Absolutely, thank you and good evening everyone. Thank you so much for your time and for having me again. I really appreciate it. My name is Sam Cho and I'm running for the Port of Seattle, position 2. This is the position Courtney Gregoire has decided not to run for again, in case no one knows that. I'm running because I want to see a port that works for the people of Seattle. And what I mean by that is that I think the Port of Seattle has been run like a corporation for too long, disregarding communities that are disproportionately affected by the airport. And so for me, my top priority is to make sure that the port is working for the people. My 4 priorities are to, 1, make sure we have shared economic growth here in King County. To make sure that the 5% growth here in King County, that the pie is split equitably between everyone in this county. Secondly, environmental sustainability. Tackling climate change is at the top of my list of things to do with the port having the largest carbon footprint of any government entity in King County. Third, accountability and transparency. Making sure that the port is transparent in the way they conduct business. They have a long history of doing things under the radar and passing tax levies without really getting voter approval, and so I'd like to clean that up. And lastly, human and labor trafficking. Something we don't talk a lot about when it comes to the port, but we are the 12th highest ranked when it comes to labor and human trafficking. And so that's something that I'm more than happy to answer some questions on more definitively. I came out of the primary in first place, 31.1% of the vote in a 7-way primary, which is better than even I had expected. My opponent came in with 24%, so I had a 6.5% lead over him in the general, in the primary, despite his name recognition, despite his fundraising. And so I'm very hopeful that the other 5 candidates in this race, their votes will mostly come towards me, and then I'll be able to take this race in the general. And so, for the next few weeks, it's going to be a lot of door knocking, fundraising, and various other advertising strategies.
Great, thank you. All right, so if you want to go ahead and flip over that sheet of paper, the responses to these are 2 minutes each. Matt, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Sure. How should the Port Commission interface with other public agencies and organizations?
Yeah, so I think the Port of Seattle has such a large footprint as far as the amount of land they have and the effects that their activity have on the neighboring communities. What's really important is to make sure that not just the port and the city, but also the port and the county are all on the same page when it comes to creating policies, right? One of the really good examples of this was probably the Sonic Stadium, which is a huge controversy over the past several years, and the port was not on the same page as the city and the county. And so just making sure that, when it comes to these huge policy plans that are affecting everyone in the region, it's really important to collaborate. Another example is SeaTac Airport, right? The airport is a huge polluter, but also it has a huge footprint for those who are living down in South King County. Or we're talking about Burien, Des Moines, SeaTac area, right? And so making sure that the Port of Seattle is interfacing and has a liaison constituent services with those neighboring cities to make sure that whenever it comes to discussions about expanding the SeaTac airport, right, or adding another runway, or doing whatever in terms of freight corridor between the ports and the airport, making sure we have everyone at the table. I think it's really important. And I think part of the reason I've gotten so much labor union support is because this is something I truly emphasize, right? Local 242, MLK Labor, the carpenters, they've all really liked the idea of making sure that they all have a place at the table when it comes to these decisions. So it's not just municipalities, county, but also the stakeholders, the residents of that county, the people who work in the port. And so making sure that everyone has a seat at the table and they can provide that feedback and commentary whenever something big is happening is really important.
Thank you. Elizabeth, would you like to do the second question?
Sure, I would be happy to do the second question. What do you see as customer service policies and goals for stakeholders and tenants?
So as far as policies and goals for stakeholder and tenants are concerned, I really I talk a lot about making sure that the port is catering to not just big corporations like Alaska Airlines and Delta, but also small mom and pop shops that might want to open a little a kiosk at the airport, right? And making sure that we're accommodating families who are disproportionately impacted by the activity of the port. So I think, again, establishing that channel of communication between the port and the stakeholders and the tenants, right? making sure, you all know that, I-1000 passed in the state legislature, and we're currently fighting to keep it passed. But if that goes through in November, we have this really unique opportunity to start targeting some of the contracting, some of the business, some of the work towards minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, right? Things that we previously were not able to do with our stakeholders and tenants because we were afraid of what I-200 might have meant for us. So I think that the next port commissioner has a unique opportunity to really expand the product offerings and the customer service offerings to our neighboring communities. And that's what excites me about the port in this next term, is that there's opportunities coming forward that never existed previously. And so that's kind of where I see the customer service and the stakeholder engagement kind of coming to fruition.
Great, thank you. Laura?
Tell us about the opportunities and challenges that you see for the port's lines of business.
Yeah, so I mentioned this when I was here in the primary, but one of our distinct advantages as a port is that, one, we are a naturally deep port, right? So we don't need to artificially dig underneath for these huge ships to come in. But two, our proximity to Asia is extremely advantageous. If you think about Los Angeles and Long Beach, California goes inward, and those ports are actually not as close to Asia as we are. And so we actually have 1 or 2 days of an advantage when it comes to shipping freight over there. We should exploit that advantage. But the reality is we haven't really made the infrastructure investments that we need to take advantage of that, right? I'm talking about things like on-dock rail, right? Things where we can get rid of an extra layer of drayage at the port if we just had rail lines that go straight up to the boats, and we don't need to truck them in between the rail lines and the boat, right? I'm talking about trying to lower some of the costs of doing business so that we can stay competitive with the ports of Vancouver and the ports of Prince Rupert, where we've been losing a tremendous amount of business. We've lost about 4 to 5% of the market share in this region to those 2 ports up north, because we haven't really been making those right infrastructure investments. Canada has invested a tremendous amount of money in their rail infrastructure, right? And we have not, right? It costs me $400 to $600 less to ship out of the port of Vancouver or Prince Rupert than it does to ship out of Seattle, right? And so for us to become more competitive, we need to make the right infrastructure investments, and I think that's where we need to turn our heads to. The other, just real quickly, the other challenge is the growth of King County will make it so that SeaTac Airport is growing exponentially as well. Karen Kaiser has a bill that explores a 3rd airport in this region. And I think by 2022, we'll have an idea of where that 3rd airport will be. But at the end of the day, SeaTac is bursting at its seams, and managing that growth will be really important for the next port commission.
Thank you. Jeff?
What is the port's responsibility when it comes to protecting and lifting up workers? What do you think are some opportunities for improving the port's relationship with organized labor and those workers who do not currently have access to the protection of a union, such as Uber and Lyft drivers?
Yeah, so this is actually something that I've talked to a lot about labor about as I go through these endorsement interviews and just kind of talk to leaders in the labor movement. One of the biggest things is first, SeaTac Airport has exempted itself from the the $15 minimum wage, right? Which is, in my view, ridiculous, right? They're wholly in SeaTac, so they should be complying by that $15 minimum wage. And so for me, one of the first things I hope to do is pass an ordinance or a resolution that says that SeaTac should and must, at minimum, meet that minimum wage standard. But secondly, and the bigger issue here is misclassification of workers, right? If you talk about the people who are driving the trucks, if you talk about people who do work at the port, one of the biggest issues that the unions will tell you is that these workers are misclassified. And what I mean by that is the vast majority of those people are 1099 contractors, right? Even though they work for the port full time, even though they're doing just port work, they're 1099. And the problem there is that they don't get the benefits that they deserve, right? I'm talking about healthcare, right? Wages. I'm talking about all the other paid vacation and benefits, right? These guys and girls who work at the port, drive trucks from the docks to the boats, do the baggage handling, all these things, they're all contractors, right? And so one of the things that I really want to do is a top-down, assessment of like who's truly a port employee and who's not, right? And reclassify workers from 1099 to W-2 so that they can get all the benefits. I think that's one of the most important things we can do at the port. And that's not just wages, but also healthcare, right? The unions love to talk about how the port doesn't provide good enough healthcare, that they could provide the bare minimum when it comes to healthcare. And so that's one of the things I really want to look at is say, okay, what kind of healthcare can we provide? You know, some of the unions will fight you on it because their CBAs have healthcare included, but I think there's a way where we can kind of create an exchange.
Thank you. And now we'll open it up to questions from the board. The responses are 1 minute each, starting with Alice, then Jeff, then Matt.
So totally on board with the reclassifying workers and making them employees. I think that's totally awesome. Do you have a sense of how much that's gonna cost, and are you worried about figuring out the cost of that?
I don't have a sense of exactly how much that will cost, but I'm also not worried about paying for it. I think the port has a $200 million budget surplus. And so I think that, you know, when it comes to outsourcing some of these jobs, we need, like I said, we need to stop thinking of the port as some for-profit business and, you know, that caters to these corporations. I think first and foremost, it's a public entity that should, and its workers should be treated like public servants, just like any other government entity. And so I really want to reverse that culture over there. And I actually think with my talks with the port, there is a little bit of, with the new executive director there now, I think that compared to, you know, previous CEOs or executive directors, there's a little bit of more of a openness to that idea. So one of the first things I'll do is do a feasibility study and a budget, an impact study to see how much this would actually cost.
Thank you, Jeff.
So we're interviewing your opponent tomorrow, and I'll ask him the same question.
Yeah.
So top two now, you've talked about why you'd be a good candidate. Can you specifically contrast yourself with your opponent? Not necessarily go negative, unless you want to, but
No, I mean,
why are you better than him specifically?
I think I'm better because I have more relevant experiences. I mean, I'll just tell you what he's gonna say right now. He's gonna say that he was the former mayor, that he worked on ST3 and brought ST3 to the east side, that he knows government contracts. You know, he has the same talking points. But at the end of the day, if you look at my experiences and what I've done, you know, I have an export business that worked directly with the Port of Seattle. You know, I understand the logistics side of what the port does. You know, before I came, in the primary, I talked a lot about, you know, Moses Lake and all these other different ideas about how to make the port operate better. And so I think my experiences are more relevant. I talk about contracting, you know. When I was in the Obama administration, I worked at GSA, which does all federal contracting. And we had a huge push in the Obama administration to do minority business contracting, specifically with the SBA. And so when I talk about my priorities, I'm really extrapolating from my experiences both on the state level and the federal level, right? And so that's, for me, the biggest contrast is that, I don't need to go negative. He has great experience. I don't knock on him for that. But the question you should ask is who has the most relevant experience?
Thank you. Matt?
So you've been running for a minute now. What is an issue or issues that you started this race not knowing a lot about? How have you educated yourself on it so far, and how will you continue to educate yourself?
That's a good question. So I have, you know, from the beginning, I thought I was more of a maritime guy because of my experience in exporting to Asia and all that stuff through the Port of Seattle on the sea, maritime side. I've learned a lot about the airport, just through talking to people in the community. You know, if you talk to people in South King County, they'll say that Sam shows up to everything, right? Because the reality is that I realized that was a blind spot for me, because, you know, I'm there, I don't live in South King County, right? I don't know what it's like to live underneath the flight path of the airport workers. So I've actually made it a conscious effort to be in Burien, SeaTac, you know, South Beacon Hill, which you wouldn't think has a problem, but Beacon Hill has a huge problem with airplane noise right now. And so being in those communities and kind of listening to what their complaints are and their issues are, has been really helpful for me to learn their perspective. And my plan is to continue to do that, right? I think decisions are made by those who show up, and I show up. And so for me, between now and November 5th, it's gonna be me being everywhere, at all the places I can possibly be to kind of listen to people and make sure that it goes.
Thank you. Constance?
So earlier you admitted that the airport, global shipping, the port is one of the biggest polluters,
Yes.
polluter industries here. And you also talked about a goal of growing those industries. So what are the steps you would take first to grow those industries sustainably within?
So I think that one of the things that we need to do is, I talked about this last time I was here, but offloading some of the cargo from SeaTac Airport to Moses Lake. And the reason that makes a difference is not just because we're shifting flights from SeaTac to Moses Lake, but because, most of our exports in the state come from the eastern Washington. And so the idea of trucking a bunch of goods from Eastern Washington all the way to SeaTac Airport to fly out doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think by, opening up Moses Lake for cargo, we're gonna cut down on a tremendous amount of emissions by shortening the amount of trucking that's necessary to export. But also, when I talk about equitable growth, you're spreading some of that King County growth into Eastern Washington. So I think it's a win-win situation for us. But also on a more higher level, we need to start doing research and investments in more sustainable sources of energy, right? Well, I'm talking about electrification. Airbus just announced a hybrid plane, right? We're talking about biofuels. We're talking about charging stations across those seaports so that boats can start converting into electric ferries, cold ironing. I mean, there's just a ton of stuff we could do investment-wise to make sure that we are becoming more sustainable.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Elizabeth?
Have you worked with at all or interacted substantially with any of the current or previous port commissioners? And
Yeah.
do you feel like you've got a pretty good relationship or kinship with any of them?
In fact, I just got off the phone with Fred Feldman before I came in here. I have a pretty good relationship with Fred as well as Ryan Calkins. And I've talked to, Courtney's on her way out, but I've talked to Courtney Gregoire on human trafficking a lot. And so one of the things that I do is I actually run my policies by these people. And I say, what do you think? Where would you be on this issue? And that's the discussion I just had with Fred. He and I were just talking about districting the port race, right? And where he stands on that issue. I think we should district the port race, right? And so one of the things that I do is, make sure that I'm bouncing these ideas off these other port commissioners so that when I come out with them publicly, I don't get a bunch of backlash from them, right? They're saying, oh, Sam doesn't know what he's talking about, right? Even though they might not publicly support certain policy issues, they're in spirit, in line with me. And so I would say, I have a very good relationship with the port commissioners. And actually, when I was a legislative assistant for Senator Hasegawa, and so I always remind them that how they used to come into my office and lobby me for stuff. So, I've known them for a while now, or especially the Northwest Seaport Alliance and all these other port-related agencies. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
Port of Seattle, one thing I know about Port of Seattle is, if there's like a lot of land,
Yes.
a lot of real estate.
Yes.
How does the port factor into our larger regional struggles around housing and housing affordability?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and a lot of people ask me about that because I do think that the port has a role in housing, but not just housing, but in homelessness, right? I mean, just think about all the jobs that the Port of Seattle has when it comes to mechanics, engineers, people who are, and so for me, one of the things that I want to look into is whether or not we can actually build some workforce housing on Portland. A lot of the unions will push back on that because they're afraid of converting industrial zone land to commercial residential. I think we can do it without converting anything. I think that there's, like for instance, the Inner Bay Armory, right? I think the Inner Bay Armory up north is a great opportunity for us to redevelop that area into mixed use or light industrial and have some, commercial space, but also some housing up there, right? And I would love to see the port kind of take that on and be a leader in that initiative so that the Armory is repurposed for workforce housing, right? The idea being that you can take people off the streets, put them in these temporary workforce housing, train them to be mechanics or whatever in the port, and then when they get their foot under them, they can go out and look for their own housing, right? But having this transitional housing for them would be really helpful, and I think that's what the port can do, make a huge difference.
Great. Other questions? I kind of want to just give you a little bit of time to talk about that some more.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so workforce housing I think is huge. There are other pockets of land that the port owns that is being underutilized. Like if you go down to West Seattle, there's this, on the way into West Seattle, there's this plot of land that was once a landfill that was just paved over. I know that there's some talks about redeveloping that area. The problem is, whenever the port does something, they put out an RFP, right? And in the RFP, there's certain things, you get scored, right? Like they have criteria, and based on your proposal, they'll give you points, and then the highest point wins, right? But the criteria on those RFPs are not very friendly to proposals like housing, right? They want stuff that's related to the port, right? So if you were like if you said, let's do housing on that land, and another guy was, let's build a lounge for the longshoremen, right? That would probably get higher points than the housing, right? And so what we need to do is really relook at some of the criteria we grade these RFPs on and see, where we can actually, make a conscious effort towards housing, right?
Great. Thank you. Any other questions? We have, okay, we're actually close to time anyway. So if you want to go ahead and do a 30-second wrap up.
Yeah, well, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been, I'm glad I get a second chance at this. You know, I think what's important here is that, you know, you asked me what differentiates me from my opponent, and I said that it's the relevant experience. But I also want to just say that, you know, I've done my homework, you know, and when I say that, I'm not just saying like, I looked up a bunch of, you know, things on the internet, but I've gone out and I've talked to people. And, you know, I've talked to people down south in King County, people at the port, and I think that really shows through the people who are supporting me. You know, I have the endorsement of 10 legislative districts here in King County. I have the endorsement of King County Labor, the longshoremen, just about every major union as it pertains to the port. Am I done? Oh, okay. So, you know, just putting that out there.
All right. Thank you.